Good evening and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. Tonight I'm taking a break away from the Hunter Chronicles and doing a little bit of audio analysis. And the audio analysis that I'll be performing is a first blush analysis of this newly released video, a very short video, on the Las Vegas Shooting Archive channel. And the title of the video is Las Vegas Shooting, Las Vegas Boulevard, the Tropicana Self Park. Alright, my favorite tool, of course, to do this analysis is Sonic Visualizer. It's a free software tool used by lots of people worldwide, mostly to do bird call recognition. So here we have the signal after I converted it from the online format to an MP3, and we take a look at it in waveform, and we see immediately that there's some big activities over here. Well, let me get up a drawing tool. So immediately we recognize something here which looks to be gunshot sounds, and then we see some other signals here which also kind of look like gunshot sounds, but we don't know. And then we see probably voices or other noises there. We see a little burst of something there. We see it taper off there, so this is background noise. So this signal in general has what we call pretty good signal to noise. If we up the amplitude a little bit, then we can start to see more of the signal and the more of the fine structure of it. In fact, if you notice on the left hand side, let me go over here, remember the hotkey. What's the hotkey for this zoom thing? Control 1. That way I can get to it quickly. Alright. So if you'll notice over on the left, you'll see that the maximum scale on the top is 1, and on the bottom it's 1, it's -1 essentially. And so when we look at signals, we always look at the signal to noise. So for the first part of it, or actually when we're looking at the gunshot sounds, we see that the top end and the bottom end are pretty tall. They go almost the way to 1. Maybe this signal here reached 1 and clipped it, i.e. exceeded the maximum capacity. Maybe not, but for the most part these signals are well below the maximum dynamic range of the recording device. And in comparison to the sounds that aren't the signal of interest, which are pretty small by comparison, then the ratio of these two green parallel lines, top and bottom, to these two green parallel lines is what we call signal to noise ratio. Now noise is a little bit of a misnomer here because it's not truly noise. There's real sound there, but it's the ratio of the signal for the interesting sounds versus the uninteresting sounds. So this is a pretty good recording overall for what we want to look at, which is gunshot sounds. Alright, so there we have the waveform. Is there anything else I noticed there? Nope, I don't see any missing spots or gaps or whatnot. If we look at these theoretical gunshot sounds here, we see that overall the largest sounds are partial into the first half of it, and then it takes a big dip here, and then it continues down like that with some sporadic stuff there. So overall I would say that this recording had a pretty clear line of sight look at where the source of the signal is. and that it did vary. And we'll have to ask ourselves, why did it vary? Could be many different reasons. And we'll get into that when I pull up the log frequency. So why don't we go ahead and do that right now. Let's pull up down here on another panel essentially the power spectrum. Now this is what we call a spectrogram. All of you who are longtime viewers of my channel understand what a spectrogram is, but for those who aren't, I'm just going to repeat it. Along the bottom here we have a time scale, and on the left hand side over here we have a plot of frequency. So here we can see the frequencies at any point in time, and the intensity of the signal is directly proportional to the intensity of the color. Now there are many different scales for colors. Some are like this, green. But before we get too far there, let's go ahead and talk about the scale on the left over here, which I have chosen to be a linear scale. I could have chosen it to be logarithmic, in which case we see something like that, because logarithmic favors viewing the signals at the lower frequencies. But for doing power, I like to use the linear scale. So let's ask ourselves where the most power is being expended. Well, that's kind of a bad question. You have to ask at what frequency the most power is being expended, because there's a lot of power, for example, right here. Let's get back to drawing some things. This is a siren, and it's a pretty intense sound. It's pretty bright yellow, but it's at mostly one frequency with harmonics. This is a percussive sound. It goes up and down, and it's not as intense in color, not as bright as this, but it covers a large frequency range. So either way, these two sounds are going to be very prominent in the scheme of things. We'll be able to hear them very clearly. And similarly, these gunshot sounds here, which we can clearly see is, big deviation right there. There's some gunshot sounds there, are pretty clear too. But the question becomes, what are these things? Because they do not look like that, and while they're up and down, we have to either qualify them or disqualify them as being perhaps sonic shock wave recordings or something else, and we'll get into that. So the first look at the power says that we've got a recording of one volley of gunshot sounds. We've got some sirens, and we've got some other unknown thing. On the left hand side over here we see some voices. These straight lines are some not naturally occurring sound. It's a mechanical sound or electronic sound of some form, and there's a lot of them. So we'll have to take a look at those. And we'll also notice that by and large the background sounds are more dominant on the right hand side than they are on the left hand side, probably due to the fact that once the volley stops, the automatic gain control can kick in and amplify the quieter sounds more than it can over there. Now if we wanted to look at what the background sounds really are, what we could do is up the amplification on this, and we could see lots and lots of things that are in the background that we couldn't see otherwise. And I do this because I want to determine what the cutoff frequency is. And so here we have the cutoff frequency being right there, which, if you understand how things work, then that means that the recording frequency was about 30,000 hertz or 30 kilohertz. But this is a dB squared, meaning that the signal was squared, so the frequencies tend to be a little higher because of that multiplication. And you'll notice that in this view I can clearly see if there's any gaps, and I see no gaps. I see that this recording has been converted a couple times, because we have this top end, we have this little bitty top end there, and then we have another one there, so at least 3 times. Probably the original recording, the upload to YouTube, and then my conversion down from YouTube to the format that I chose. But overall, internal to the recording device itself, it does a pretty good job going up to about there. And so the recording devices, for the power anyway, is probably recording about an actual 28.8 kilohertz or something like that. All right. So rather than looking at the waveform, which isn't going to give us any more detail, let's not look at that, and let's enable the power spectrum up there, and right now is on a logarithmic scale. All right, and down on the second one, let's go ahead and go to a log frequency, which gives me a better examination of things that I want for purposes of identifying gunshot sounds and everything. So here we are. We got to get all the parameters set up to where they look good. All right. Now here we can start to see the fine structure of everything coming along. And the first thing I'll do is try to classify which gunshot sound this is. So I'll increase the x-axis, and I'll look at that and say, that looks a lot like Volley 7, because Volley 7 is the only one that has a really two gaps in here which are not consistent with a perfected cadence, shall we say, at the start. Most volleys are either continuous or have bigger gaps. So I'll say that looks like Volley 7. Okay, so the next thing I would do is would pull up measurements that I've made, because Volley 7 is not new to me. So I have measured this volley inside and out, and what I do is in this bottom panel here, I will pull up all of the measurements I made on one Volley 7, in one video, Oasis Apartments. And I chose Oasis Apartments because it's far away from the din of the chaos, and because it's far enough away that it's not going to be in the middle of the gunshots, meaning that it's so far to the side of the gunshot path that the lag is going to be one-sided, that is the gunshots do not come over me, therefore the lag measurements will be all comparable, oranges to oranges. Had the gunshot came over me or went from left to right side, then the lag would be measured offset to where the bullet path is, and I don't want that. So I take Oasis Apartment, and also it's still, it's not moving. It's important that these things aren't moving, because then the muzzle blast timing doesn't change. If either the camera or the source of the sound, i.e. the source of the recording device, is moving relative to the other, then of course it creates a Doppler effect, and the time between rounds is altered based upon the rate of movement. Oasis Apartments is not moving, therefore the time between rounds accurately reflects what's happening at the source. So if I go ahead and pull that up, and here we have it in a little red, and pull it into my view of things here, and then let's turn off some of the noise, so no overlays so I can see it, and let's eliminate the center line also. All right, so here in the middle we have the log frequency plot, and at the bottom we have these red symbols. Now, do they match? Well, that's a good question. I guess if we were to make this top one smaller and this one a little bigger, like that, and then we were to lower the amplitude a bit, and then we were to pull it down, so we get just that section of it right there. All right, now we're talking. So let's try to align that, see if it aligns. If it aligns, okay, so both the start and the end align perfectly, and pretty much every other bright yellowish line matches up pretty well with the timings acquired from the Oasis Apartment. So this is a match. This is Volley 7. And we've also identified, since they match up almost perfectly, that this camera is not moving its position relative to the source of the sound, which means it's not moving its position relative to Oasis Apartment or any other camera which is stationary. So that's good for us. So we can make some good measurements here if they are possible to make. Just to look carefully at that, what I'll do is I'll expand this out and move it over to the first volleys here, or the first part of the volley. And similarly, is there a way to get rid of that stuff? I forget. Yeah, there we go. Wanted to get rid of the time scale there, so we have just the lines. So if we position the red lines right in the center of the stuff, then we can see that here at the start they match up to within the tolerance that I put them in at. That is probably plus or minus 5 milliseconds. And then I do the same thing for the other end of it. Now this is just to make sure that, you know, things line up on the front and the tail end in a way that I'm comfortable with. In a full-on analysis, I would go ahead and make markings, and I would verify every single one. Those all look good. So we have a success in identifying this volley. So now we can pretty much get rid of this and make that little pane small for the time being, and get these two panes back sort of equal again. All right, so here we are. What do we do next? Okay, well, we've identified that it's Volley 7. Rather than looking at the fine detail of Volley 7, we next start looking at some of these other things. Well, some of these things are just so apparent that it's ridiculous. These, yeah, I can mark this again. It'll make it a lot easier. This is a siren. And as you can see, the intensity on the left is less than the intensity in the middle, which is less the intensity in this bright yellow part here. This siren was approaching us, and it approached us and then changed its frequency. It changed the type of signal it was broadcasting here to something else. Okay, so we've got the siren identified. If we were to change the plot to a display that favored frequency versus time, then we would start to see some other things too. We would get a more precise definition of the frequencies of things involved. Remember, this uses a fast Fourier transform to translate this amplitude signal into these spectrograms, and the size or window, as I would call it, of that FFT or fast Fourier transform determines how accurate the signal or the time will be, but you can't have both. If you have a large window, you get a very accurate measurement of the frequency. If you have a small window size like 256, you get a very accurate time of when the signal changed, but the frequency becomes fuzzy, and so you have to look on both sides of it. So you look at the one where there's a high frequency, so we see yep. And when we do that, and we up the amplitude a little bit on that, we can see a lot of different things here. For example, here are voices. This is probably a car horn, and again, this is a siren. It has harmonics. We don't know what these things are yet. This is the gunshot. All right. Let's see what else we can get here. Well, I don't really know what these sounds are, but let's go ahead and let it play. We're going to try to identify these sounds now. So we'll let it play. Yeah, pretty much as I thought. Those are car horns. So somebody's got their hand on the horn for a long time here, because it goes all the way through most of Volley 7 all the way to the end of this little video. Very good. And if we start looking closely at some of these voices here, all right, these voices over here, they all look female to me, are fairly calm, but here we see a little bit more intense voice. So whatever's happening between here and there is getting the girl that's recorded on this thing a little more excited. Okay, so we got that nailed down. Let's look closely at these big signals now that are kind of annoying. Okay, what do we see? Well, if we back up here to the this power proxy, and we bump the frequency, this window size up a little bit. All right, there we go. And we change the scale to linear on the frequency side. And then we bump the amplitude way up. We can see that these sounds occur quite a number of places, just lesser amplitude. So right here they're strong, here they're a little bit weaker, here they get weaker, and then they get even weaker there, but they exist for probably the entire segment. It's just, you can barely see them in there. So whatever it is at the moment, it exists. It's just far away and coming closer. So there's something making a noise that's coming closer to us. So right away, that probably is not a gunshot, because there's no volleys or gunshots that last that long that are known. Well, you say it could be an unknown gunshot. Yeah, everybody likes to think that every bump on the graph is a gunshot sound, but they're not. So if we take a closer look at this on the log frequency scale down here, and expand it out, and we're at window size 4K, so we can get my scale back up, measure this, get a measurement tool, and we can see that they pretty much bottom out at 1500 hertz and top out at 4000 hertz. And if we go to the right, in particular, we can see that these other sounds, while they overlap a little bit with them, which we obviously recognize as gunshot sounds, don't quite measure up. But we have to be careful and look closely. Is there anything in here that looks similar to those? No, but perhaps we don't have the amplitude up enough, right? So if we turn the amplitude all the way up, in fact, let's use a different scale completely. There's one called fruit salad, which basically puts things into different kinds of bins and shows the top end better. So here we see we get a better look at some of the top end stuff, particularly with the horns, car horns, and then we can see these noises over here, which are the ones we're trying to identify. It's interesting that as the volley starts, the gap between these for a couple gets kind of smaller than way back here a little bit, but not by too much. So the volley, the gunshots, which obviously can be heard very well for whatever is happening here, is causing the frequency of those to change. So that looks to be people related. All right, can we further disqualify these as gunshot sounds? Well, let's take a closer look here. Are there any gunshot sounds that produce that big a spike here? Not really, but let's change the window size down to 512 and look again. So now we're going to be able to look at the timing of these more, in which case the peaks will become a little bit more prominent for the gunshots anyway. And no, they all cut off. So there doesn't look to be any gunshot sounds here that are even remotely similar. Now, from my past experience, and we'll notice right away that these things stopped abruptly at around 1200 hertz. And regardless of what amplification we use, they just don't get much action down at the lower frequencies, which is not how either supersonic cracks or regular muzzle blast work. They all have a lower frequency component, and the more you amplify it, the larger it appears on the screen. So for example, if we go over into the gunshot sounds here, you can see that this area is pretty well blurted out because everything has some low frequency component too. So here, if we get a reasonable, if we set the amplitude so we get a reasonable amount of amplitude, and we go back and look at those other things, there's nothing for them. So unless they were produced by a completely different gun, then they're not gunshot sounds. So let's look at the timing between them. So I'm just simply going to make some crude measurements here of how often they occur because they're pretty regular. 0.39, 0.3940. That one's 0.4, 0.4, 0.4. So on the order of 0.39 seconds, 0.4 seconds. And they're pretty regular, but not entirely. So I really have never heard of any automatic weapon, which would have to be automatic because they're too regular to be semi-automatic, that has that frequency. So pretty much they're out. So what could they be? Well, it's a high frequency sound of a very narrow and quick pace. This would sound like a high-pitched tap, and this would sound like a rock hitting the ground, or a ball peen hammer, a light tap on a piece of hard surface. But there's no ringing involved, so whatever's happening dissipates quickly, so whatever's producing it means that it's hard attached to some surface, which dissipates or stops the ringing from occurring. So I'm going to put this as human related. I don't know precisely how or what, but let's change the amplitude on it and see if we can see anything. Let's go back to the blue scale, shrink this up and look at the amplitude. Okay, so we see that not all of them are equal, and it looks like every other one is more energetic than the one in between. So I'm going to have to say this is a bipedal movement. This is some tapping produced by bipedal movement where one leg is favored for whatever reason over the other, although not always. As they pass the camera, it gets less and less. As they approach the camera, it was pretty weak way out there. So this is one person, probably running, because walking produces a slightly different, wider, lower frequency sound as the foot hits the surface, and there's either a tap or a rock, or maybe it's a high heel on a woman. Well, that's a good question. Is this a woman? Well, should we be able to tell the difference between a woman and a man? Nah, I'm not going to go that far. So this is a bipedal movement where maybe a rock is stuck in the bottom of a shoe. They're running, and or they're wearing a tap. Why would anybody be wearing a tap? You know, dance tap. But anyway, that's what it is. Okay, so now we got it. So now we can eliminate it from all the places where it occurs in the gunshot sound because, for example, right here, we see, you know, that looks an awful lot like a supersonic crack, except that it stops at 1200. But without knowing the complete scale and the history of that thing, you might incorrectly classify that. And here's another one right there. Let's see. If I up the amplitude, there's probably more in there. Yeah, there are. So everywhere we see one up here, these big spikes, there's going to be something down below. So here and here and here and here and there and all over the place. Those are not gunshots. That's a person. Some aspect of a person running. All right. So what else can we see from this? Oh yeah, we're going to talk about the amplitude of the signal itself, of the gunshot itself. So we get this to a point where we can see roughly what the amplitude is on a fairly large scale. All right. So if we look at this if we look at this section above this line, then we can see some patterns in here. And then if we look at it on the top, we can see a different pattern, kind of a similar pattern. Okay. But then to the right, we can see on the top so what's happening here? Well, the volume is going down on these shots for some reason, and one possible cause is that the gun is moving to and fro, or the camera is moving to and fro. Can we distinguish for this region, this first region here? So can we distinguish which is which? Let's see. I have to pick a sound. Now let's pick the running sound. So if the camera is moving to and fro, should be picking up this. Well, when do they pass? They pass. Alright, well, let's look at it from the gunshot side. If the gunshot was moving to and fro, then these sounds down at the bottom would be changing. Alright, so let's lower the amplitude on the gunshot sounds, and we can until they start to disappear to see what's happening. Okay, so from this we see that the first 1, 2, 3, 4, and not so much the next two, were louder than these in the middle, and you can see then, let's get my little drawing too. Over here it starts to pick up again and stays pretty constant. These are loud, but in between they're soft. Okay. Again, that could be caused either by the camera, you know, looking at, pointing towards the source or moving away, or it could be the gun itself. Hard to say, hard to say, hard to say. Okay, now let's look to the right a little bit. Okay, well, I can't tell from this. When we examine the video, perhaps we can tell. It could be either or both, so that's a question. So let's take a look at things generally here that we want to identify. Here we see something happening. In here we see that there's little spikes unrelated to that person walking showing up. Oops, I have the too big a magnifier on. So here, for example, we see intergap things happening that are unrelated to, that's a runner, so can't count that one. Is that a runner? No. Okay. That might be something. That might be something, but that might be something. All right. So we've identified a few things where in between rounds, unrelated to the primary signal and unrelated to, well, we haven't talked about it, but these are echoes. These things are echoes from a nearby source. And I say nearby because the distance between the primary signal and the echo is small. Therefore, there was some sort of structure either probably behind the camera that received and this is probably a muzzle blast, and then reflected it back towards the camera, and probably it's on the opposite side of the camera recording microphone, and therefore the signal is weaker. Or it could have been a ground reflection, because ground reflections usually come in after the primary signal also, and if that's true and this distance is small, then the distance to the source of the sound is great, because as the distance to the source of the sound radically decreases, these become further away. Okay, so we've sort of talked about the reflection or echo, and these are probably supersonic cracks, very faint, and we don't see them throughout the Volley. But then, this is Volley 7. Let's talk about Volley 7 a little bit. Well, Volley 7 is the most misunderstood volley in the entire shooting, right next to 11, which comes in a close second. And Volley 7 is misunderstood because it sounds quite often, based upon where you're at in the venue or outside the venue, it sounds a lot like two guns overlapping, but it's not. And I've done numerous videos on that. But if we take a graphical look at this, I keep track of lots of different Volley 7 locations. In this, I've got 30 some. Here I display 3 per screen. And let's get to something which looks really good and distinct. Yeah, here's one. Here we can see I have 3 of the log frequency plots for 3 different recording locations. The top one is the West Bleachers. The middle one is from the Lost Uber video. And the bottom one is from VIP. And you can see that they're all kind of different. The top 2 are kind of similar. And for these, I kept the amplitude the same on the gain, and the scale the same, and the window size the same. So these can be compared across the board, although comparing amplitudes is always dicey because of the automatic gain circuitry. And here we see that Volley 7 has this unique characteristic of showing the supersonic cracks for a small portion of the volley, depending upon your location. Here and here we can see the supersonic cracks. So the supersonic cracks get louder as the bullet comes closer to your location. But down here on the last one, these supersonic cracks are very, very small. And indeed, in some, such as the one that we're looking at right now, the supersonic cracks are non-existent, essentially. So that means that this recording occurred somewhere that was pretty far removed from the action. Okay, well, let's take a look at, here again you can see that the major difference, and I'm just going to go through these a little bit. Oh, that top one is really interesting. This top one is 11, that's Cop Cam release 11, number 85, is very interesting in that it shows some rather unique display of the intensity of the muzzle blast that we don't see on most other recordings. So it does a pretty good map of the intensity of the muzzle blast. This little thing right here is the noises made by the cop cam, the beep, 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 beep crap. These are the supersonic cracks overlapping with the muzzle blast down here. And so you can see both the crack and the muzzle blast were loud, meaning the gun was pointed right at that location, perhaps even hit some things. Because on the next one right below, you'll see these big sounds here, which are most likely hits for something. And that was against the wall out on the boulevard. And then you'll see this one little weird thing over here, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But this is 1185, and 1185 is a good example to look at. So we go down to the 1185, and as you can see, I got lots and lots of recordings of Volley 11. And 1185 is it's a non-stationary recording. It goes across the middle of the venue. And let's go ahead and let's see this one. So once again, and just get something that's of decent size here so we can play with. Here again, we can see that for these, however many there are there, both the muzzle blast, which dominates the frequency range down there, and the supersonic cracks were really loud. And that means that the path of the bullet passed very close at this point in time to that recording location. But for the remainder 2/3 of the volley, it did not. The path of the bullet was pretty far removed. And so this is the nature of Volley 7. It swept, back and forth across the venue in a way which, depending upon your location, would have only segments of it hitting you. People out on the Cop Corner, I call it, the intersection of Mandalay Road and the Boulevard, of course, being closer, will record almost all of the sounds, both muzzle and just supersonic crack, and they got hit from portions of this volley. The one thing I did want to note is that here towards the tail end, we have something that's bright. And that occurs at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just prior to the 6th from the end shot. So keep that in mind, because we want to always ask, what the hell is that thing? Because lots of people are looking at that going, well, what is that? But when you look at, gotta get rid of that. When you look at this most recent recording, and we go out here towards the end, and we look at that specific 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here we have, in this region, a signal that looks a little bit different than the others. But if we turn on our time, we'll notice that there really is no muzzle blast that's different. The only muzzle blasts that occur here are well known. You say, well, maybe there's 2 bullets at once there. So then you'd have to go back and look at several different videos to try to figure out what's going on in a more basis. And what you'll discover, and I'm not going to go into it here, is that for this single shot, well, let's go back over here. I'll show you precisely. Let me think a second where it was. Oh yeah, back to our. In this recording, I've also have an overlay here for the lag. Now the lag is the difference in arrival time between the supersonic crack and the muzzle blast. And for the Oasis Apartments, which I'm going to show as an overlay, the lag is always very small, but nevertheless small in the sense that it's only a fraction of the time between rounds. So if the time between rounds is 1/10 of a second, then the lag at Oasis Apartments is, on the order of 60 or 70 milliseconds. And I've taken great care to measure that lag precisely and plot it. And we're going to overlay it onto this 11 under bar 85 frequency diagram. And when we do, we find something very, very fascinating. So let's get this into a bigger mode here and start talking about it. So we see that over here where that bright spot is corresponds precisely to the time in which the lag as recorded in Oasis Apartments changed from almost the largest to almost the smallest, meaning that the bullet took a radically different path than the one before it and the one after it. There's only one muzzle blast there. There's only one bright spot. And they all jive with the regular volley. So in my opinion, this is not, I repeat, not a shot from another gun. It's just too improbable that it would occur at precisely the same time. But when you look at it from 30 other videos, of which about 10 or 12 of them show the phenomena in a way that's useful, it's very, very clear that there was something different about that round. That, you know, it could have been a slightly could have been a slight misfire, or it could have been a slight different load, or anything like that. But it nevertheless was fired from, and this is very, very important, it nevertheless was fired from the precise same spot as all the other bullets that came in this volley. And how do I know that? Well, because after you've done about 6 dozen of these things, you can triangulate the location, and I'm not going to go into that here. And the location turns out to be precisely the same as the rest of the volley, meaning that it is the same gun. Or you would have to argue that there's 2 people in the same location, and they're shooting and they fire at the same exact time, and, you know, it just becomes so improbable as to be ridiculous. So that's my opinion. And you'll notice also too here that during the bright segments that the lag was changing, and since this is at Oasis Apartments, the smaller the lag, the fuller the bullet is away from them, and vice versa. And this lag plot will look different for every location. So the one that would occur, if we were to plot the lag out for this particular recording, it would look substantially different, but it would still show these anomalies just in a different way. Okay. So let's see. I'm probably getting long in the tooth here. Let's go over to my notes, see if I've missed anything. So let's turn on my notes. I've got notes here, and then before we go to the, let's see, something up here covered that. In this region of the, this region, right? In this region of the muzzle blast, you see that the echo, for whatever reason, seemed to be a little bit more powerful, meaning perhaps that either the gun was pointed more directly towards the camera, and or the camera was more directly pointed towards the reflecting source. So we'll have to keep an eye out for that. Let's see what time. I'm going to turn on the center line so I can see what time that occurred. So remember 26 or 27 seconds. Here we have honking horn. Yeah, I already identified that. In this section, the voices are almost as loud as the guns. Here we have some very faint snaps. We covered that. Supersonic cracks. Camera. You know, here I was going to argue that the camera was turning away from her too, but I can't really argue that. We'll have to wait for a video resolution. Little stress in the woman's voice. Siren change. Okay, what about at the top? I know I have notes up there too. Running sound. Yeah, that's what I've concluded. One line gets favored. Already covered that. Runner is starting to pass by the camera at that location at right about 18 seconds. So let's keep an eye out for that. Include it with something on the shoe. Momentarily sped up as the volley started. And then this, I don't know what that is. You see this tap produced by the person running. It seems to have a few more echoes there at time frame 21. Don't know. We're getting close to the end here, folks, so bear with me. All right. I think that's all I want to do on audio analysis for the first blush. Let's go ahead and identify, look at the video. First, let's identify, well, we have to look at the video, don't we? Bum, 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 bum. Here we are. Okay, start at the front. So we're on the street. Yep, that's clear. We can see Mandalay in the background. We can see the marquee. We can see the stop sign. Let it run.
Holy shit, like fucking major.
Somebody's pulling out there. Hear the sirens now, and we can hear the ladies talking. Okay, across the street, there are some buildings. There went the cop. There went a sound of the auto. I didn't notice. I didn't mark the sound of the auto going by, but it was at the tail end.
I mean, everybody.
Here we are. Now we're gonna find out. Self Park. So, as the video said, Self Park. Oh, wait a minute. We're at 17, almost 18. There we go. Back it up. That was the source of those taps. Lady with shoes on. I don't know why. Hear it? There's a lady. So the camera is moving in the direction of them. The camera is moving in the direction of a reflective surface, which is probably the source of the echoes of the muzzle blasts. They're holding hands, so that's why she's favoring one leg. And they started way back there, and they come over here. They run by. Then the volley starts. Okay. And I said we needed near 27. Okay, so yeah, at 27, the camera moved back towards the echo reflecting surface, which would be this piece of concrete there for the Self Park. And there's the honking horn. I don't know which guy it was. Maybe this guy oncoming. Somebody's honking their horn somewhere. Okay, so now let's identify that location. Where is this? Okay, Mandalay Bay, Google Maps. I took the time to identify it, and it turns out that it is, if the Mandalay Bay, oops, let's get over there to my Mandalay Bay being up there, this will eventually turn out to be right here at the Self Park for Tropicana, which is half a mile away from Mandalay Bay. So that agrees with what we saw in the audio analysis, that it was far distant removed. All the bullets would have been to one side of this thing, and the bullets would have, probably covered the entire range of the green marks there, sweeping left and right, and the middle portion would have came closest to us, and that one bullet would have came close to us also. Close is relative. It would have been close enough that we could hear the supersonic crack, which means it didn't stop over here at Cop Corner. It didn't stop in the venue. It probably stopped or hit something out in this area. Would be my guess. I don't know that for a fact, but that would be my guess. So I think we've identified everything. The only other thing we could do is go to Street View and show you exactly what it looks like. There's Tropicana. Oh, looking for the, oh, there we go, down there. I'm looking for the Self Park sign. Here's where it was. Back up a little. Kind of went too far. This is approximately the view, except that we're in the middle of the street. Yeah, all right, Richard, let's see. Let's put it right there. Forgive me for being lame. I believe that this... of course, we've got a train in the background. I'm just going to talk over it this time. 1 every 15 minutes. I believe that this is the best view and location for this video. Alright, well that's it. Kind of long-winded, but I think I covered everything I wanted to, so we'll catch you in the next one.